Hello, everyone. I'm hoping you can hear me. My name is Janice McLaughlin. I'm one of the trustees of the BSA, and I'm here to welcome everyone to the first of the plenaries of this very different 70th anniversary conference in this virtual space. I think we spent part of this morning getting used to it, but I think we're getting there and understanding how it works, and thanks for people's patience with some of those little teething issues, etc. So I'm going to introduce the session and then pass on to Professor Sylvia Walby, who will be chairing this session. This is a panel plenary, and the theme is austerity. And I wanted to thank the members of the panel who are here today, because this was due to be a plenary panel last year, which had to be postponed because of the chaos of last April. And here we are still in a degree of chaos, particularly if we look globally at the situation. But I think what we recognise, if we're thinking about looking at the future or rethinking the future, as we've begun to talk about, that austerity is something we cannot ignore, and indeed has been brought even more into the light by some of the issues of COVID. So I think in the next hour there is much to discuss and to think about and to take forward. So I'm very grateful for our panel and our chair to provide this opportunity for us to discuss these crucial topics for society as well as for sociology. So I'm going to pass now on to Professor Walby. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. So welcome to the plenary panel of the British Sociological Association on austerity. What a shame we need it. What a shame we still need to discuss austerity, and that in the context of COVID, that we are looking at a future in which a potential emerging fiscal gap might be dealt with again by austerity. So what has sociology got to offer in our analysis of what's going on? What does it mean for the rising of society? How do we help in understanding what's going on? This means understanding the implication of austerity for multiple intersecting inequalities, including gender and ethnicity, including class, but not only class. It means documenting with accuracy the forms that austerity takes, including its implications for basics, even food. It means reintegrating the analysis of the economy back into the heart of social theory. How should we be thinking about property, ownership, public, commons? That is, how do we revitalise sociological understandings of property? So austerity makes sociology again confront those issues of inequality and how we should be addressing these forms of inequality in our discipline. We have four excellent speakers who have contributed in diverse ways to this field, and introduce them in turn. Our first speaker is Fran Darlington-Pollock, who is speaking from the Equality Trust and who is also a lecturer in geography, our neighbouring discipline, University of Liverpool. Next, I'll be introducing Professor Akwugo Emejulu from the University of Warwick, who has written several books on the issue of austerity, minority women, survival, and, crucially, resistance. Our third speaker is Kayleigh Garthwaite from the University of Bristol. Sorry, I beg her pardon, the University of Birmingham. She is a Birmingham Fellow in the Department of Social Policy, Sociology and Criminology, and will address some of those issues of food. And our fourth speaker is Guy Standing from SOAS, University of London, School of who is going to address some of those issues, commons and property. So, thank you. So our first speaker, over to Fran, and to speak on those issues of inequality and austerity. Thank you, Fran.
So thank you all for having me here at this wonderful conference. And I do feel a little like I've snuck in the back door as a population and health geographer, but hopefully as an allied discipline, it won't seem too much of an interloper. But rather than as a stealthy geographer sneaking in, I am here as chair of the Equality Trust. And if we're going to talk about anything stealthy, let's talk about stealthy austerity. So for any of you not familiar with the Equality Trust, we were set up around 2010 by Professors Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, and it coincided with the publication of their book, The Spirit Level. And this is a book that really showed us why equality really is better for everyone. And that message continues to be critical, not just looking back over the horror of the last year, but actually going back even further. So to frame this, I'm going to tell you about a launch that I went to last week, and this is the launch of a new policy report, which was is about and is so titled Levelling Up Health. So I'm yet to read the report itself in detail, so I won't comment on that, but I will comment on what the Secretary of State for Health and Care said at that launch. So first, I'm going to quote directly. We want to level up life, and you can only level up life by levelling up life expectancy. And for me, improving the disparities in healthy life expectancy is absolutely at the core of our levelling up agenda. He went on to say around that quote that the COVID-19 pandemic that we're all living through is the extra motivation, direct quote, needed to do something about those inequalities. Those unjust differences, and I'm adding and emphasising the word unjust, those unjust differences in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy, so extra motivation. Now, my twin had a baby quite recently, and where he lives, so I'm shoehorning some geography into this, where he lives, where he was born, he can expect to live to about 59 in good health, so 59 years of good or healthy life expectancy. But if he was born here where I live, which is not even 15 miles away, he might expect to have another up to 66 years of healthy life expectancy. So 15 miles gives you 7 years difference in healthy life expectancy. But were he born in Richmond upon Thames, he'd expect nearly 72 years of healthy life expectancy. So some of us might be able to convince ourselves that 200 odd miles is enough to explain more than 10 years difference in healthy life expectancy. I think it's quite hard, but some of us might be able to. But it's probably even harder to convince ourselves that just 15 miles can give us as much as 7 years difference. And the reason I emphasise that is it's those interactions between people, places and politics that is shaping those differences. And it's important to highlight that because it shouldn't take a global pandemic or 127,000 deaths that the UK has suffered to be an extra motivation. We need to address those differences which we know are the product of deeply embedded entrenched divides in society, which actually the decade of fiscal austerity did a lot to worsen. So we know that fiscal austerity was a policy response for many countries because of that global financial crash, and it can be a tightening of public purse strings alongside increases in taxation. And in the UK, the approach lent really quite heavily on public expenditure cuts with only modest increases in taxes. And the aim of any austerity drive is to reduce the budget deficit, which did happen. But what also happened was that the attack on public services, the freeze to public sector pay, those sorts of things exacerbated the conditions which will perpetuate disadvantage and disproportionately stack the odds against those already living in constrained circumstances. And what's key here is to remember that this was all going on before the pandemic struck. And why this is key is because many people began to point to something alarming that was happening during that time in the health profile of our population. And it was a stalling to nearly a century of sustained improvements in life expectancy. So basically the rate of improvement had slowed. Rather than being a kind of diagonal line like that, seeing improvements over time, it had slowed down and stalled like that. So it began to emerge in around 2014, but it actually then got worse. So for some groups, specifically women in the most deprived areas, they actually saw their life expectancy decrease. So it wasn't just slowing, it was falling as well. Now, public attention and indeed political attention to this issue has been varied. And I know that if I look in my social media echo chamber, for example, I would see that everyone is completely up in arms about this. But I know that a wider look at society suggests perhaps not. And this is really the crux of what I want to say in this panel here. If I could see everyone looking at me in this kind of virtual room, I would think I'm probably, or I'd assume that I'm looking at a room full of academics, or at least a room mainly full of academics. And some of you, the kind of things that I'm saying, I anticipate the sorts of things that the other speakers on this panel will say, you'd be very much in support of. You'd have seen some of the empirical evidence of the harm of austerity. You'd have created some of the empirical evidence on, or written about the empirical evidence on the harm of austerity, the impact on inequality and the threat to society. But I say that those of us that think that, those of us that are evidencing that, and I'm saying that both as an academic but also as an activist in my role as chair of the Equality Trust, that we're not actually doing enough to get that message through to those that need to hear it. So back in 2017, again, before COVID, before this pandemic, we saw research from the then Shadow Equalities Minister suggesting that as much as 86% of the burden of austerity was falling on women. And this came about through things like losses through changes to tax and benefit. And that was since austerity began. But it's also because of those persisting gender divisions that we have in unpaid labour, disparities in earnings and hours worked, and that wider segmentation of women in the labour market. And we know that where the burden of care is disproportionately falling on women, women will be more vulnerable to cuts in social and welfare security. We also know that really enduring stereotypes mean women are often the first to be considered when economic instability requires employers to restructure contracts through things like part-time hours or rotational work. And this has become even more apparent in the context of COVID. So think about the use of the furlough scheme, or who needs the furlough scheme. Also think about who's been shouldering the burden of homeschooling and care more generally in the context of this pandemic. So before COVID struck, we already were seeing that inequalities were plaguing our society. So the conditions in which we're born, we're living, we're schooling, they're affecting our social, economic and health chances. And these conditions aren't evenly distributed across people or between places. So if you then put on a policy that is systematically disadvantaging those already struggling, it's hard to assume that there wouldn't be consequences. The consequences were creating the conditions in which COVID could thrive, creating the conditions where policies that could effectively halt the virus were really only able to be adhered to depending on your own relative security. So the levelling up agendas we have seem blind to the things that are mainly trying to level down. The 2021 budget didn't appear to be the great departure from a decade of fiscal austerity. We've seen things like, for example, that there will be future changes to the security nets our welfare state should provide, such as the loss to that £20 uplift to universal credit, just about when the furlough scheme will end. And one of the campaigns we have at the Equality Trust is for the implementation of Section 1 of the Equality Act, which would have forced public authorities, including the government, to think about whether or not their actions would reduce inequalities resulting from socioeconomic disadvantage. So would austerity and indeed responses to the pandemic and the budget have been the same if that section of the Act was enforced? So we need to do more to get our messages not just to people in positions of power, but the people themselves. We should be organising, and we should do more to show that equality really is better for everyone and that austerity is the antithesis of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Akwugo, will speak on the title, Is Even Worse Than We Imagined.
Yes, I'm here to make everyone feel worse. That's my job here. But before I get started, I just want to say kind of thank you to the BSA for organizing this panel. And I'm just really pleased that you guys were able to organize this event. Again, that was really scary last year to have the kind of whole conference canceled. And so it's really incredible that you guys have been able to do this online. So kind of big thanks to Sandria and the rest of the team for organizing this. So thank you so much. So we only have 8 minutes to speak, so I can't really say much. And so what I'll do is just give some reflections on what is now 11 years of austerity. Like Fran, I just want to start with a quick definition in terms of austerity, which is tax increases and cuts to public spending. So really straightforward. But I do think it's important to always pay attention to, as Fran noted, that in the UK context, the wealthiest households actually received a tax cut. And so whilst misery was distributed to just about everyone, the people who could withstand it the most actually saw a huge benefit under the then Chancellor George Osborne. So I think it's important to understand that. The other thing just to point out, of course, is that the rollback of the welfare state is also a project of privatization. And so it's this idea that the state can't do anything but be a contractor to the private sector and also the voluntary and charitable sector as well. And so I think what's important to bear in mind here is that austerity is not just a wildly successful policy program of the conservatives and sometimes the liberal Democrats since the last decade, but it's also a governing philosophy. It's an ideology of slash, burn, and shrinking of the state, and of shifting of carrying responsibilities from the collective to the individual. And I think what's important, what I've been kind of thinking about, and my partner in crime in all this, Leah Bassel, who's at the University of Roehampton, is really thinking about the aim of austerity is to fundamentally undermine social citizenship and social citizenship rights. And I guess I would disagree with Fran at this point of people haven't been doing enough. People have been doing a lot. But the point is the doors have been slammed closed and have been closed for over a decade. The government does not want to hear from us. They do not want to hear this because it is literally the project to degrade social citizenship rights and to make it almost impossible to articulate and make claims to the state. And in many ways, what we see is austerity is the promise of neoliberalism fulfilled. But what I wanted to do in the kind of short time that I have is just to give you two examples of what this slash, burn, and shrink the state, what that does to the way that we think about ourselves, about our social relations and our relationships to the state. Because I think that's something we need to kind of bear in mind when we think about coming out of lockdown and the destruction that will greet us once we all kind of get back into public spaces. So I want to give you kind of two examples of what this kind of shrinking of our horizons, shrinking of our ideas of care look like. And I first want to start with an example that might not look like austerity, but in fact is riven with kind of austere thinking. And that's with the SOAS report, or the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, the hilarious report from about 2 weeks ago. Which at first glance doesn't look like it has anything to do with austerity, but I think really speaks to a moment. But I'll just say just very briefly. So, the report is bad when even the private sector is like, no, we really are that racist. What are you even saying? So when the private sector says, no, we actually are super racist, that the report is nothing but a political hack job. But what's important about the Commission's report is that the aim of the report, of course, is to deny the existence of institutionalized racism. It's to disavow and erase the legacy of the 1999 McPherson report, and also to kind of undermine all the hard work of anti-racist activists, academics, and policymakers. But the point, which I think is important, is to slam shut the door of any claim or any idea that the state can intervene, promote, or enforce equality legislation. And it shifts responsibility, as I've said, from the state to individuals, organizations, and employers. And this is what's so important about the shrinking of the possibility of social citizenship rights. The austerity program is about kind of shrinking these horizons of our understandings of what inequality looks like, the dynamics of which they take place, and so reducing everything to an individualized level and individual dynamics, and thus denying any possibility of kind of collective solutions to these difficult, thorny, wicked problems of structural inequalities. The other example, just very briefly in the time that I have left, is just to think about what was the dynamics between the government and Marcus Rashford's kind of interventions last year, 6 months ago, a million years ago. What is time now? I don't know. But just as a reminder, the footballer Marcus Rashford, of course, through his advocacy, managed to pressure the government to provide free school meals during lockdown, and also help connect hungry families and kind of small businesses, and kind of create this network to distribute food parcels. What Marcus Rashford did was absolutely incredible. I have no criticism for him, besides the fact that, of course, Marcus Rashford is doing what David Cameron always wanted him to do, which was fully express the big society, right? Of doing, this is about kind of shifting any kind of responsibility of the state onto an individual, in this case, a millionaire footballer who's acting in his role, drawing on his lived experience of food insecurity in order to do this incredible philanthropic act. But I think what's important about the dynamic of what Marcus Rashford did was thinking about the ostentatious fight that the government picked with him. So I think this is important. It really speaks to kind of austerity as a governing philosophy, because the fight is important because the government was signaling, and is still signaling at this time, that literally no one can make a claim to the state, not even hungry children. And I think that's what's really important here. And whilst in the end, Rashford was able to kind of successfully pressurize the government to do what needed to do, but the point was always that there was no care to be extended anywhere and refusal was everywhere. And I think that's what's really important. And we see that play out with refugees and asylum seekers, people with disabilities, and of course, frontline workers who are trying literally not to die as they deliver our parcels to us in our homes. So just to wrap up to say that, again, to disagree with Fran a wee bit, is that in my work with Leah, we've been mapping women of color's activism for a decade now. And I want to end on quite a sour note, because what we found is that whilst we see incredible mutual aid work, incredible self-help, volunteering work, all of this amazing, innovative kind of resistance to austerity, what we're also seeing for the first time in our data is this mental health crisis amongst activists. People are exhausted, they're fatigued, they're tired, and I think we need to kind of take seriously this idea that despite the protests that we see in terms of kind of the policing bill, in terms of kind of violence against women, despite these protests, what we're seeing again and again are activists leaving the scene because they are so burnt out and exhausted from a decade of austerity. I'll finish.
Thank you very much for showing us how it's even worse than we imagined. So we'll move to my next speaker, Kate, who's going to speak on when did emergency food provision stop being so emergency? Over to Kayleigh. We need to unmute Kayleigh, I think.
Can you hear me now? I've been having some problems with my internet, so hopefully you can hear me now. Is that okay? Brilliant, thank you. All right, yeah, so thanks so much, Sylvia, and thanks to the BSA for having me and for organising this panel. It's really great to be part of it, and I just hope my internet holds out because it's been really shaky. So please, Sylvia, do give me a shout if it's not working okay. But today what I want to do is focus on how emergency food provision has become really an increasingly visible and an expected feature really of austerity Britain. You know, we see in supermarkets, pubs, cafes, football grounds, community centres, you know, we often see food bank donation points, they're just everywhere. You know, we see stories in the news of kids who've given up their pocket money, you know, to donate to a food bank. And so while obviously there is a huge generosity and goodwill behind food bank donations, it sort of speaks a bit to that point Akwugo was just saying about, you know, we kind of sort of lose the bigger picture of why people are needing to use a food bank in the first place. It becomes sort of an individualized thing. You know, somebody donates to a food bank, we get this idea that a problem's solved, you know, and that's really, really not the case. So I just want to highlight sort of really how food banking has grown in the UK basically in the past 2 decades. And then just speak a little bit about some work that I've been doing over the past couple of years, looking at how our emergency food landscape in the UK compares to a North American context, and sort of just discussing some of the work I've been doing, working with activists over the past couple of years as part of a sort of Solidarity Alliance work we've been working on. So just to give a bit of context then, if we go back to the year 2000, the Salisbury Food Bank was the first food bank to be set up in the UK by the Trussell Trust. I'm sure probably all of you have heard of the Trussell Trust by now, but if not, they're the UK's largest food bank franchisor, Christian organisation. But at the Independent Food Aid Network, IFAN, which is a network of independent food aid providers, of which I'm a trustee, we estimate that actually overall there are more than 3,000 Trussell Trust and independent frontline food aid providers. When we look at the food that's distributed by local authorities, you know, places like Salvation Army, as well as food banks from schools, universities or hospitals. So in just 20 years, we've gone from one food bank in Salisbury to more than 3,000. And what we've seen with COVID-19, it's just really further exacerbated this. And more frontline charities have turned to providing emergency food as well in the past year as a response to the increased need that's been brought about by the pandemic. So in my work at the moment, I'm sort of questioning, well, is what we are witnessing now then really an emergency response, which is what food banks were initially set up to provide? Or is it actually representing something that is chronic and more permanent? So at the same time as this sort of growth in emergency food, we've seen how current representations of and responses to poverty in the UK have become increasingly fragmented. So we've got period poverty, funeral poverty, pet poverty, more recently laptop and data poverty. These are terms that we see quite often. I think with the rise of food banks, we've seen how food poverty in some ways has become sort of synonymous with the face of everyday poverty. And what often happens is that activity to sort of tackle these individual forms of poverty tends to sort of advocate responses to just specific issues or symptoms of a low income. So, the provision of food or sanitary products, rather than actually stepping back and really having a focus on the underlying causes. So focusing upon sort of charitable responses to poverty, albeit temporary and necessary to meet need, is problematic. So we've seen in the US, Janet Poppendieck, she's described food banks as being a sort of moral safety valve, which sort of reduces the discomfort that's evoked by sort of visible destitution in our midst by actually creating the illusion of effective action and offering us sort of ways of participating in it. So coming back to that idea of what Akwugo mentioned about the big society and how Marcus Rashford's, massive campaign led to, basically what we saw was people individualising and providing, responses to this problem rather than sort of more structural solutions. And so a new programme of work that I'll be developing later this year as part of the Philip Leverhulme Prize is going to explore some of those causes and nature of the UK's movement towards this permanence of food banking, similar to the North American context, where we've got a much longer and enduring history of charitable food provision. So in the US, St. Mary's Food Bank was set up in Arizona in 1967, and that was actually the world's first food bank. But now today, Feeding America is a nationwide network of 200 food banks and 60,000 food pantries across the US. And so when we talk of food pantries, they're most alike to our sort of food banks in this country, more the sort of community style, food banks. And so in Canada as well, again, food banks were introduced as an emergency response in 1981 as a response to recession. But then, fast forward decades later, and food banks are more embedded in society than ever. And what we've seen is, COVID-19's exacerbated and sort of really exposed those injustices and inequalities. And so we've seen that, the rapid rise of food banks and similar emergency food aid initiatives has really been a central feature of 2020, and it just really doesn't appear to be sort of diminishing anytime soon. And I think really concerning is that sort of accompanying this significant growth, we've seen a sort of wider rise in actual direct funding for charitable food provision through governments. So for a long time, my work's looked at how, government and political responses to food banks have, denied perhaps the existence or the need for them to be existing in the first place. Governments have regularly said that, there are multiple complex reasons why people use food banks. But we've seen the UK government, DEFRA last year, pledged £16 million towards Fair Share and other sort of smaller food distribution charities. And in the US, the Department of Agriculture, they announced $850 million towards food banks. In Canada, a further $100 million. So we've seen a sort of a direct funding for charitable food provision. And as well, in all of these contexts, we've seen sort of increasing corporate partnerships as well that are centred around providing charitable food. So for instance, Andy Fisher, he's a campaigner that I'm working with and an author of a book called Big Hunger. He's described what he terms as a hunger industrial complex, which basically is, it's characterised by the ability for corporations to reduce their own labour costs, benefit from tax reductions and subsidies, all the while achieving profits. Whilst at the same time, often these corporations are employing workers who aren't actually paid the living wage and who haven't got, their rights aren't fully protected. And what we've seen with COVID is, it's allowed really this hunger industrial complex to flourish, as many food banks have had to sort of step back a bit and scale back their efforts to think about food bank exit strategies and social justice, and instead move towards a model that offers food to those who need it on a large scale immediately. So I mentioned earlier, since 2018, I've been working with a group of non-governmental organisations, national networks, grassroots activists and academics in North America and Western Europe. And we're seeking to sort of complement and amplify the ongoing work of powerful grassroots networks and movements that have been ongoing for years, at community, national, regional, global levels. to really sort of resist and dismantle this sort of private charity and philanthropy model, and instead move towards advocating for adequate food and nutrition as a fundamental human right. So our Rights Not Charity Alliance, we're working together to build a shared analysis of the increasing use of charitable food aid and transnational corporate food banking as an ultimately flawed response to hunger and poverty. And also we've been working towards thinking about how we can build collective strategies of resistance and alternative models and practices to promote the fulfillment ultimately of the right to nutritious food in our respective parts of the world. So we argue that it's crucial that emergency food isn't framed as the solution to the increased need across these so-called wealthy nations, such as the UK, US and Canada. So emergency food isn't addressing the root cause of poverty. You know, leaving the matter to charity, it exacerbates poverty. It allows governments and citizens to consider the problem as being solved, and it also ignores income policies and human rights. So we need to focus on the structural drivers and broader inequalities that lead to food insecurity in the first place. So I just want to end by just emphasising that, you know, we can't go back to the old normal of pre-COVID. We need a recognition that it's the realisation of rights and not charity that's essential in order to ensure that the further institutionalisation and normalisation of emergency food aid initiatives in the UK and elsewhere should not be accepted as inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kayleigh. We'll now turn to Guy Standing, who will talk on Plunder of the Commons, Austerities, Concealed and Quotas. Guy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a very few minutes to tell a complex story. I wrote a book about the precariat and then looked at how rentier capitalism has been expanding the precariat. And I became aware that the inequalities that are affecting the precariat are much greater than can be measured by conventional income statistics. And it coincided with what was the 800th anniversary of a foundational document of our Constitution and the Constitution of all democracies. And that is the Charter of the Forest. And the Charter of the Forest established the right of everybody to have a right of subsistence, a right to work, a right to live in the commons. And it stems from Justinian law, Roman law, common law, of AD 534, which says that certain things cannot be made private property. They belong to everybody or they belong to nobody. And this essence of the commons, I think, is much more than has been examined by Ostrom and her colleagues in the United States. And the commons are part of our social wealth. They're not private property, they're not state property, they belong to all of us as commons. And there are 5 types of commons: natural commons, social commons, civil commons, cultural commons, and what I call knowledge commons. And we also have something that we've lost in modern analysis, which when we go back to our history, we see there was a tradition of commoning, a way of living, a way of working, a way of subsisting. And these things have been affected dramatically over the centuries. So I wanted to look at, in this book, The Plunder of the Commons, I wanted to look, first of all, how commons come into existence, and then how commons are lost. And it was very clear that the acceleration of their loss during the austerity era has been absolutely dramatic. By usual agreement, nature belongs to the commons. The land, the sea, the air, the minerals, the parks and everything, they're part of our natural commons. But in addition, we have things that are bequeathed to us over the generations. And with there's tradition in British history that something became a commons if it had existed as such, with initially the lovely phrase, time out of mind of man. Gradually that was reduced until 1623 and the Act of Limitations to 20 years. So the National Health Service, for example, became a commons of Britain in 1968, when it had existed as a commons for 20 years. And the interesting thing is when you look at how commons can be lost, they can be lost by social forgetting, they can be lost by neglect, they can be lost by enclosure and encroachment, commercialization, privatization. And I looked at all of the different types of commons, how the different changes were taking place. And I learned while doing this, the research for the book, that there was something else, something far more dramatic about how during the austerity era, we have lost our commons. And it is what I've called neo-colonialism and financialization. And you can go through the different aspects of the commons to see how we have been neo-colonialized in the process, mainly through private equity, financial instruments, and so on. If you think of the natural commons, we've had 5 waves historically of enclosure. And it's not appreciated by many that during the last 20 years, over 10% of British land has been privatized. And much of that land has actually been taken over by global finance and lost. We've also seen an attempt by the Conservatives and Lib Dems to privatize our Forestry Commission, and now they've been commercializing and selling off land in the forests. We've lost thousands of greens. The right to roam has been restricted. We have 27,000 public parks in Britain, and 92% of the managers of those parks reported in 2016 that they had been subject to savage cuts in their ability to maintain those parks. Urban trees are part of our commons. We've lost hundreds of thousands of trees that have either been privatized or cut down. Water, of course, was privatized by Thatcher and is now run by private equity, foreign private equity companies. Worst of all, in a sense, because it hasn't been noticed by many so far, is that the Queen has been able to privatize our seabed, turning thousands and thousands of acres of our seabed that should be part of our commons, and that was made part of our commons by King Edward I in 1297, has been auctioned off to build wind farms. In the latest round of auctioning, places 5 times the size of Hull have been privatized and given over to multinationals to make profit from wind. It goes on in minerals and so on, but the natural commons is only part of the story. The social commons has been dramatically hit during the austerity era. We've had privatization of housing, we've had privatization of student accommodation, of refuges, of very, very strong privatization of our National Health Service. It's been privatized for a long period. I document the many ways the NHS has been privatized by stealth before the pandemic. And we've seen elder care turned over to private equity. If you then turn on to things like POPs, privately owned public spaces, Boris Johnson, when he became mayor of London, accelerated the privatization of our commons, our urban commons, selling it off to foreign property corporations and Mitsubishi and financial institutions and so on. And you have a loss during the austerity era of our civil commons. The privatization of prosecution, the privatization of defense lawyer, the loss of any respect for due process, both in universal credit and in various other respects. The privatization of probation, of course, was a big failure, but we've also had a systematic privatization of our prisons, justified for various dubious reasons, and turning them into profit centers, and as a result, overcrowding and all of the rest of it that you know about. We've also had an erosion of our cultural commons, lost the sense of public architecture. It used to be that every council had a public architecture department looking after the design of properties. But we've lost that. We've seen the privatization and neocolonialization of our museums, our art galleries, our theatre, and a loss of public art. And finally, we've seen an erosion of our knowledge commons, both in terms of a loss of any commons in information system, a systematic privatization and commodification of education in various respects, and of course, you have the development of intellectual property rights through the TRIPS legislation of 1994-95, in which millions and millions of things that were not private intellectual property are now private intellectual property. And the end result is that we need today an equivalent of the Charter of the Forest. We need a Charter of the Commons, on the left, a progressive agenda to resurrect our commons and build back our commons as a base of our society. And that is the message of my book. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much to all of the panel for their excellent contributions. There's a chat line running in which there's been a discussion, and now I'd like to ask that people turn that into a set of nice questions for the panel, please. Would you like to put questions into chat? And while you're doing that, I would like to ask the panel, do you have questions for each other? Although in some ways your contributions are absolutely in parallel and complementary, I can also hear significant differences in your theoretical approach. Would you like to raise those with each other and have a little bit of a discussion between yourselves before going into the general audience?
I suppose I could start, and I think having watched the chat, I think it's really refreshing to see and hear some of the responses to what activism is going on here. And I think it's important to emphasise that when I was talking, it's not a case of that there isn't work going on. I think there's a huge amount of work going on. It was a question of are we getting it to the right people apart, and is it just, it's the people who are affected most who are shouldering this burden of activism as well. And Akwugo, what you said about that kind of mental health experience of activists, particularly in response to the pandemic, because of how much has been put on them, that's really alarming. But that also highlights that this is, for me, it's seeming that it's happening in a particular group of people who are fighting their own fight, when actually what we want is all of us to fight each other's fight. And I think that that's where I'd like to see more. I think that and Kayleigh, what you said about amplifying people's voices, that's, I think, again, what we could do more of. So some people are amplifying voices that need to be heard rightly, but perhaps not enough of us are doing that as effectively as we could do. And if we were better at doing that, we might not see some people burning out because of the activism that they're having to do in the first place.
Thank you very much. I'm going to see if I can pick up some of the strands from the chat and turn them into questions. The current question is about the nature of the social policy changes which might be asked for. But there's a further angle to that. Are we asking for the extension of the state? And where does the panel think that there should be limits to the extension of the state? Because there have been several calls for the expansion of social policy in the state, and yet on the other hand, calls for the expansion of the state not to extend into the securitization of the state, which is also occurring. And I think that question might be heading in your direction.
Yeah, so that was from earlier in the chat, and that's a great question in terms of how the state is expanding and shrinking. And I hope the audience understands that we only had 8 minutes, so we can't cover everything. But I think you're absolutely right in terms of thinking about the hard-nosed state in terms of kind of having the monopoly on power. And I think these kinds of like old school analyses of the state are actually really important for this moment. I will say this, that part of how we have come to accept, well, some of us have come to accept austerity. I think the Tory voting public is, I think, the ringing endorsement of austerity is precisely because of the ways in which the state has expanded, and the state is seeking to punish those others, right, who are to blame for the state that we're in, right? This is the most embarrassing and I think kind of naked and obvious ways in which one seeks this kind of consent to have your livelihoods deteriorated by the state, is by kind of seeking vengeance and punishment on those that who seemingly don't belong. And so the spectacular policing of protests in Bristol and in London around kind of the Everard Memorial, all of that is to say, know your place. And also to have a kind of visceral sense of meting out justice to those who seek to disrupt the social order. And so I do think it's actually really important to think about the state in the, as Janice faced, right? In terms of thinking that I've always been interested in. As an American, I've always been fascinated by an all-encompassing welfare state, because that is not something that is possible in the American context. But of course, there's always the other side of the state, which I think is actually really important to bear in mind. And they are fundamentally connected to each other. And so when we think of, I don't in any way want to kind of romanticize the state, because the state is also kind of jackbooted in that way. And so I think we have to have this more sophisticated understanding of what the state is and how it operates.
Thanks very much. I'm going to pick two more questions from the chat and merge them. One was to suggest or ask, is crisis an inevitable part of capitalism? And another is asking, what is specific about the crisis? And maybe that one is for Guy. Yeah, Guy, would you like on that question of whether crisis is an inevitable part of capital accumulation, or what is the specificity of the moment and the changes which are going on? And that, I think, speaks to your question about suggesting that the decline of the commons is new rather than something which is intrinsic to capitalism.
No, I think we are in an era of rentier capitalism. Neoliberalism was the phase in the 1980s and 1990s, and it has morphed into a system where all the wealth and income and power is going to those who own private property, financial, physical, or intellectual. And the taking away of the commons has been part of that process of increasing the strength of rentier capitalism, so that the owners of property have done extremely well out of the pandemic, for example. I think that we have, in that context, and referring back to the previous question, that we have to think of the state not just as government and the rule of public, but actually what the institutions of society that make up the state are required to do. Traditionally, with the commons, you need the stewards, you need the government and the sovereign to act as the public trustees. Their responsibility is to preserve the commons and hand it down to the next generation according to the principles of intergenerational equity. And you need strong gatekeepers who are going to hold the stewards to account. And traditionally, historically, both stewards and gatekeepers have been part of the state. And today we need to erect better, more responsible stewards and erect strong voice in the form of new forms of gatekeepers who were deliberately weakened, and I document that, during the austerity era, so that the gatekeepers weren't able to hold the stewards to account, and therefore we saw an erosion by neglect and encroachment and so on. It's part of the neoliberal agenda, but it's morphed into this form of rentier capitalism.
Thanks, Guy. We've got another question about differences in forms of state. And again, this one to Fran, or more maybe Kayleigh. It's come in two forms. First, is Scotland different? And is the local state better than the national state?
Yeah, well, I can start because I was just looking at some of the last couple of points on the chat from Alison and Lynn, and it came up a bit earlier on as well about the particular case of Scotland and how they've sort of tried to move, shift away from some of the austerity policies when it comes to food and food provision and free school meals. And I think one of the interesting things about the Scottish context is at the moment, the Scottish Government have been working with IFAN, the Independent Food Aid Network, to move towards a cash-first approach that instead of people, seeking emergency food, instead people are sort of signposted towards local welfare support and the provision of grants and actual income, rather than actually having to go and access emergency food. So, you sort of, people aren't having to be, subject to the potential stigma and shame that we know is so often associated with emergency food. Because we know often the reason why people are seeking it in the first place is because it's a last resort. They've got no income. So instead of, thinking about increasing and further institutionalising emergency food, the Scottish Government have been doing some work around these cash first approaches, which I think is, is obviously, it's obviously a positive. And I think just having a flick through some of these questions on the chat here as well, thinking about, instead of thinking about targeting perhaps like national level change and thinking about what we can do at a local level, I think, that's something that we're trying to do at the moment as part of another project I'm working on, which I haven't actually mentioned today, which is called COVID Realities, where we're working with low-income families, parents and carers who have dependent children, to really find out what's going on with their income and lives because of COVID-19. And it's very much a participatory project where we're working with parents and carers to try and think, right, well, at what level are we trying to, what policy level are we trying to target here? And again, I think this comes back to the questions that were raised at the very beginning of the chat around, who does the heavy lifting then of activism? Should it all fall onto, for instance, we're working with people who are on, the lowest incomes, dealing with, so many various issues that are coming up because of COVID, but also issues that were there before COVID. But I think what we're trying to do, and comes back again, part of the wider discussion we've been having here is, ensuring that the people who we are working with, the parents and carers who are wanting to try and, sort of affect that change, is saying, right, well, what do you think we should do? How can we then facilitate that to happen? So for us, it's about, making sure if we have like a parliamentary event, making sure we pay panelists for the time, not just expecting it, making sure that people, for instance, we pay for people's data so they can take part in all these online events, because a lot of people actually can't access the internet as easily as some people can. So I think, it's a long answer, sorry, to that question, but just, got me thinking that actually a couple of the questions and threads that have been coming up throughout the chat are all sort of interlinked and all come back to that point of sort of, who speaks and where do we sort of try and affect that change?
Thanks. I think we've got two more running. One is asking the panel, what do you think of a wealth tax? Which guy is responding, we need a basic income. Tax, basic income, what policies are you putting forward?
Is it for me? Is this for me?
That's okay, you want to take it?
At the end of this book on the Commons, I drew up a charter of 44 articles that I thought should be the basis of a revival of the Commons and compensation for commoners who've been adversely affected by the illegitimate taking of the Commons. And it includes a wealth tax, a land value tax, carbon tax, and levies on other practices that are taking away the Commons illegitimately from us. Instead of giving huge subsidies to large-scale landowners, as has been the practice, so that someone like the Duke of Buccleuch, who inherited 277,000 acres of prime land simply because one of his ancestors was illegitimate son of a king, is completely against the spirit of the Commons I mean, he should not be receiving millions of pounds from the government as he has done. Instead, we should be taxing large-scale landowning and using that to build a commons fund to be compensating for everybody else who've lost commons. And you can take that argument into many other spheres of the loss of the commons.
Thanks, Guy. Janice, what are the questions in the chat that you would like make out to the panel?
And one question that's again come up in a variety of gazes is around the dynamics of opposition. So we've seen the questions around, the mental health crisis amongst activists. There's also been questions about, perhaps problems on the left of how to challenge and the ways in which some ideas of the left have become, taken away and been used by writers and activists on the right to challenge left positions. So I guess it was a question, I think, that kind of summarizes across different papers for anyone within the panel about, we've seen arguments about local opposition is important, but local opposition sometimes kind of, again, goes into the sort of burnout dynamic that people are talking about. So how do we, and academics I think are part of this, how do we change that and create a more alternative, genuine opposition to, as was talked about before, the sense that there's a lot of people that seem to know that austerity exists and are quite happy to see it continue. How do we change the narrative about that?
Can I take that? Can I take the final option for each of the panel to answer just briefly and answer in the order in which you spoke? So, Fran.
Thank you. So just a couple of things. I think firstly, it's about trying to separate how we think about building back better and building it as a thing attached to economic value. There's more value in society than just whether someone is kind of contributing to the economy. It's about kind of things like care. It's about how we support each other. It's reframing that, because I think that language of building back better perhaps isn't going to work if we're just trying to build a better society of something that was the version we already had. And at the same time, it's then thinking about how this works for everyone. A more equal society is better for everyone. We have some policies in place to do that. Wales has just enacted Section 1 of the Equality Act. They will be paying attention to those kind of things in your policy going forward. So I think there are things there that we can do, and policies need to use that local knowledge in a way that isn't contributing to burnout, and it be about co-production of ideas and understanding that the local context does know best. But I think that kind of answers your question.
Thanks. Hugo?
I'll just be very brief and say that any conversation about capitalism must be connected to a conversation about white supremacy. And we're not getting free unless everyone is free. And until we have a real, honest, authentic conversation about white supremacy, about kind of the ongoing imperial project, we're not moving forward. We can run away from these ideas if we want, but we're going to stay exactly where we are as a result.
Thank you. Kayleigh?
Yeah, thanks. So I think briefly as well, it's just in any conversation about, policies and who's affected, we really have to make sure that we are involving the voices of people who have got direct experience and who are most negatively affected by those policies, by those austerity policies, and, taking into account all that we've discussed today around, the costs of that, in terms of mental health or the actual physical costs. But I think really making sure we can meaningfully involve those voices, because at the end of the day, people who are actually experiencing austerity policies are the voices as well that we really need to listen to.
Thank you. Guy?
Well, let me add, because I think we've got to combat racism. It's still an evil that exists. We've also got to continue to combat misogyny, and we've got to have a class-based political strategy. All of those things are, sine qua non. I'm very delighted at the moment that 32 cities and towns across England and Wales the councils have voted to do basic income pilots. And I've been asked to do talks on BBC, local radios and so on. In addition, 4 in Scotland have voted and want to do it and are prepared. Another 4 areas in Northern Ireland. I think this sort of local initiative is something that is rather exciting, because it's a subversive ground-up movement that the Conservatives will resist. The Conservatives in the Labour Party, with a small c, will resist. But I think there's a sort of transformational atmosphere building up, which I think is going to come out once the pandemic is ended.
Thank you all very much indeed. So I think that's been a brilliant panel. You've both dissected the intellectually the issues which are facing us with austerity, and yet you still wish to find a way of thinking about what that way forward would be, and engaging in really interesting ways with the chat from 173 people in the audience. So we thank the British Sociological Association for keeping going and for choosing for this to be the opening day of the British Sociological Association annual conference. And we wish you all well with the rest of the conference. And thank you to Janice and to Sandra and the BSA for hosting this. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.